This week I came across an online video that starts out 2025 was the longest decade of our lives. Ain't it the truth? The video goes on to say that 2026 is the year that things get real because we have a lot of work to do, folks. Remember what one of our, at least part-time co-religionists, Thomas Paine, wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." So anyway, I thought that we'd start this morning by looking at Romans 13, 1-7, which has an infamous, or at least a notorious reputation in some quarters, and you'll see why. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority? Then do what's good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, you must be subject, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. Pay all of them their dues. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. That sounds pretty cut and dry, doesn't it? Now, evangelical Christians in this country love to cite this passage, especially when they're in power, or when they happen to like the president or the political party in power, as if we should unhesitatingly and uncritically obey whatever those leaders say. And don't get me wrong, we should do our best to be law-abiding citizens wherever possible, without a doubt. That part isn't in dispute. But Romans 13 really isn't about giving all governments a blank check for all time, no matter what they might do. For one thing, Paul never gave blank checks to anybody who was supposed to be in authority. In Galatians 2:11-14, when Peter himself comes to Antioch, Paul tells him off to his face. Why? Because Peter had no trouble with eating at the same table as Paul's non-Jewish converts, but when Jesus' brother James sent a delegation from the Jerusalem church to see if everything was in order, Peter and all the rest of the Jewish followers of Jesus in town, with the exception of Paul, separated themselves from the Gentiles at dinner time. As for Paul, who says later in the same letter, Galatians 3:28, that there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus, he was having none of what he saw as Peter's craven act of hypocrisy. Is it likely then that Paul would give such sterling examples as Hitler or Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot, let alone ICE agents run amok, blanket permission for all time to do whatever they wanted? The church at Rome, when Paul wrote to it, was literally under the nose of the Roman emperor. And it wasn't just any emperor, it was Nero. He was one of the crazy ones. Not as crazy as Caligula, but still off his chump, as our British cousins would say. What Paul was doing was to advise the Roman Christians to keep their heads down and their noses clean and to abide by the laws as far as they were able, because that way they wouldn't get killed. It was a very practical bit of advice given the circumstances. I recently saw a short video by biblical scholar Dan McClellan, who points out the self-contradictory nature of Romans 13, especially if you're an American. What does that mean? Well, the American Revolution was an uprising against the lawfully anointed and crowned King of Great Britain. And so, to rebel against that king, if you take Romans 13 to be an absolute prescription to obey the government no matter what they do, is to break the commandment of God. Yet once the revolution succeeded, then the new American government was now divinely sanctioned, so it was both legitimate and illegitimate at the same time. Is your head spinning yet? I know mine is. So I'll tell you what, let's take a closer look at what the government which our colonial ancestors were supposed to obey no matter what, according to the religious right of today, actually got up to back at the time. The British had all but won the revolution by the end of 1776. They had reconquered New Jersey, but they, and more importantly, their German mercenaries, the Hessians, overplayed their hand. The occupation was so heavy-handed and made no real distinction between patriots, rebels from the British point of view, and loyalists, that in the end, the British forces even managed to offend us Quakers, a sizable percentage of the New Jersey population, who could have been their natural allies. Now, the Quakers back then weren't Tories by default. That's a better description of the Methodists because John Wesley had told them not to forsake their allegiance to their king, George III. But most Quakers then and now opposed war. They were what you might call legitimists. In accordance with the Quaker peace testimony and with Paul's instructions in Romans 13, they tended not to engage in active opposition to the legitimately constituted government until that government became abusive or otherwise acted in what the Quakers saw as an immoral manner. So when the British forces occupying New Jersey lost the state's Quakers, it was like when Walter Cronkite went on the air 58 years ago next month with his report from Vietnam. This was just after the Tet Offensive, and Cronkite said that it was his opinion, after spending time on the ground with the troops and seeing how things were actually going with the war, that this country was mired in a stalemate, and that negotiations were our only way out of it. President Johnson is supposed to have switched off the TV and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America," although that might be just an urban legend. What is certain that mere days after the broadcast, LBJ announced that he wasn't running in the 1968 election. In the same way, when the British forces occupying New Jersey at the end of 1776 lost the support of the Quakers there, they should also have seen the handwriting on the wall. There's a similar story in 1 Kings 12, which I won't read to you, but I will tell it to you. So, when King Solomon died, his son Rehoboam went to Shechem, which was near the modern city of Nablus on the west bank, to be confirmed as king over the 10 northern Israelite tribes. A delegation from the tribes met him, and they presented a list of grievances to Rehoboam for him to redress before they would agree to accept him as their new king. In response to the delegation, Rehoboam asks for 3 days to consider his reply. And just as soon as they're out of earshot, Rehoboam goes to his father's advisors and asks them what they think. They tell him, "When you see these people again, speak kindly to them and give them what they want. If you do that, you'll never have another day's trouble out of them, and they'll be your servants forever." Unfortunately, Rehoboam also goes and asks advice from the counselors of his own generation, whom he had grown up with. And they say, "Just who do these people think they are? If you let them get by with this, there'll be no end to their demands." So this is what you say to them. "If you thought you had it bad under my father, you ain't seen nothing yet. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. My father beat you with whips, but I'll beat you with scorpions." And that's how you deal with upstarts like this. So when the delegation returns 3 days later, how do you think Rehoboam answers them? He answers them harshly, like the younger advisors had told him. He says, "If you thought you had it bad under my father, you ain't seen nothing yet. My father beat you with whips, but I'll beat you with scorpions." Now there's a reason folks used to say, "Them's fighting words." The people's reaction to this was predictable. They say, "We have no share in David, no stake in Jesse's son. Back to your tents, O Israel. Look after your own house, David." And they storm out of the meeting with their would-be king. At this point, Rehoboam, apparently still in Shechem, does something rather surprising. Well, rather stupid, really. He sends out an emissary, Adoram or Adoniram, to use the longer form of the name, who'd been in royal service since the last years of King David's reign. The text doesn't tell us why Rehoboam did this, nor why he chose this particular man to go out to the people. Flavius Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, says that Rehoboam sent Adoniram to issue an apology on the king's behalf. Others assume, because of Adoniram's position, he was in charge of the forced labor gangs that the delegation had been complaining about, that Rehoboam sent him to press more men into forced labor. Either way, it shows just how tone-deaf to the situation Rehoboam actually was. There was nobody whose mere presence would enrage the mob more than Adoniram, and they react by stoning him to death. Now let me digress for a moment. For almost a year now, ever since the government started insisting on expanding immigration raids, I have been deathly afraid that one day ICE agents were going to cross the line and go after the wrong person. And I think we can all see what happens when either that person or somebody incensed by how that person was treated at the hands of the ICE agents reacts badly. But when the present government has been busy sowing the wind just as hard as they can for a year now, the one thing we absolutely must not do, no matter how great the temptation, is to be part of the whirlwind that they reap in consequence of their bad actions. Any protest other than an absolutely peaceful one will give a certain federal official, who shall remain nameless, but you know who I mean, an excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act or try to declare martial law, and that would be catastrophic. I'm sure a great many people are upset / outraged / infuriated by incidents like the killing of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE agent a week and a half ago, especially since the circumstances of the killing are in dispute. On the other hand, many people who've seen the video footage aired by reputable news sources are under little or no doubt as to what happened. I'm upset by Renee Good's killing myself. She was a Christian and a poet. In fact, I agree wholeheartedly with the Canadian who recently posted on Facebook that there is no version of Making America Great that includes masked men smashing car windows, forcing their way into homes with automatic weapons, handcuffing people face down on icy roads, and shooting moms in the face. None. But I reiterate, It's more important now than ever that we don't give the federal official I mentioned earlier any excuse to act on his worst impulses. And he will take the slightest one. Believe me, we've all seen that. Anyway, it finally occurs to Rehoboam that his guards can no longer guarantee his safety while he's still in Shechem, and that his writ no longer runs there. Any authority he might have is no longer recognized there. So he hops in his chariot and hightails it back to the safety of Jerusalem, where he starts raising an army to retake the lands of the northern tribes by force. But when a prophet tells Rehoboam that the current situation is God's doing and forbids him in God's name to invade the north, the king desists and sends his army home. Now, if it's God's will that every government be obeyed, no matter what they do, then what do you do with the prophet's message to Rehoboam, that God had brought about the division of his kingdom? What do you do with all the times that God sent prophets to the kings and people of Israel and Judah to tell them that they were doing wrong? What do you do with the prophet Nathan, who goes to David himself and tells him that he had done wrong over Bathsheba? And what do you do with Paul's own statement? In 2 Corinthians 11:32-33, he tells us that at Damascus, the governor under the Nabatean king, Aretas IV, whose capital was at Petra, by the way, tried to seize him. But he escaped the governor by being let down in a basket through the window of a house built against the city wall. If Paul meant for every official of every government to be obeyed, no matter the circumstances, then he should have stayed in Damascus and taken whatever fate awaited him. That he didn't do that means that something else was going on. Paul thought that he and the people of his day were living in what Hal Lindsey, remember him from back in the 70s and 80s, would later call the terminal generation. How do we know this? Because Paul says so 2 times in Romans, one of them even in the same chapter 13 that we started with this morning. In Romans 7:31, he says that the form of this world is passing away. Romans 13:11-12 says, "For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand." In 1 Corinthians 7:29-31, Paul says, "The appointed time has grown very short, for the form of this world is passing away." And in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul talks about the day of the Lord coming like a thief in the night. It's clear then, like at least some people in every generation from his day to this one, Paul believed that he was living at the end of days. And so far, they've all been 100% wrong about this. Paul's attitude, as illustrated in 1 Corinthians 17-24, boils down to, let everyone lead the life in which God has called him. Why? The appointed time has grown very short, and the form of this world is passing away, which is from later in the same chapter. If you're counting the days until the end of the world, you're not about upsetting the social apple cart any more than you have to. You've got more pressing things to worry about. But the world stubbornly refused to end on time. So a bit of practical advice Paul once gave specific people at a specific time in a specific place under a specific set of circumstances was transformed over time into a commandment for all times and places. The fact that the secular authorities found the developing interpretation useful in controlling people's behavior could only be a plus from their point of view. What about the rest of us? Well, 2025 was the longest decade of our lives. It says in 1 John 4:1 that we shouldn't believe just any old spirit, but we should test every spirit to see whether it comes from God. The Quaker version of that is that we should test every potential divine leading that comes to us in the silence to see whether it's actually God speaking to us and through us, or if it arises from our own need, our own pride, our own vanity. In that case, shouldn't we also examine our government to make sure it's acting in a moral manner and to strive to change its path if it's behaving in an immoral manner? But I have to admit, it can be a daunting task, and the effort involved can be exhausting. In the misty meantime, as my friend the late Bob Marshall used to say, let us take to heart this prayer from Dion K. Johnson, the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Missouri, and let us take it as our benediction this morning. Holy God, I am tired. Tired of the fear-filled news. Tired of the cruelty toward neighbors. Tired of the deafening silence from leaders. Tired of being always on edge. Tired of screaming into the void. Tired of holding hope against despair. Meet me in my tiredness, O God. Meet me in the ache of these long days and breathe your strength into these bones. For the sake of your love. Amen.